Hey guys, welcome back. So for this one, we are jumping back into Carnage Volume 3 for the chaotic journey of the Carnage Symbiote stealing powers for reasons that have been a mystery up until now. And for this one, not only do we get into the full scope of what Carnage has planned, but also who gave him this idea and what sparked it. So if you're new to the channel, be sure to subscribe to catch the spills every week. And don't forget to hit that bell up top so we can squat up in the comments for the first hour. Alright, so for this one, we jump into what the Carnage Symbiote would describe as the early stages of the Carnage Symbiote being in the pursuit of something that was initially the idea of Cletus Cassidy. And like we'd seen, this had began with Carnage kidnapping Hydro Man and stealing his powers on a molecular level, which that in of itself was not only just a visceral demonstration of what could have been the Carnage Symbiote bonding with Hydro Man, copying his abilities and moving along in a similar fashion to what the Venom Symbiote did with giving Eddie Brock many of the abilities of Spider-Man, but as opposed to pursuing the symbiosis method, which isn't always in 100% copy and paste, the Carnage Symbiote is opting for taking the power from the source and applying it to himself in order to make the Carnage Symbiote become something else entirely. And when we come back, it's here we find that his next victim is none other than Dr. Jonathan Own, the Spot, who for the Carnage Symbiote, much like Hydro Man, he's come here for Dr. Own's abilities, believing that he has severely underutilized his potential as well. And so for a quick moment, I want to do a bit of a rundown on the history of Dr. Jonathan Own, because a while back in our talks on Symbiote Spider-Man, we were shown that Jonathan Own was roommates with Quentin Beck back when the two of them studied at MIT, and with Quentin Beck going on to become Mysterio, Jonathan Own, who had been working for the Kingpin, had later been given the request of reproducing the powers of Cloak and eventually his partner Dagger. But at this point, Fisk was only able to get a reading on Cloak by using advanced surveillance devices to capture a read on his radiation signature, which happened during the recent attack from Silvermane. But with having this data, Fisk ordered for Dr. Jonathan Own to reproduce this radiation signature so that he could artificially mimic the abilities of Cloak. But later that evening, after all the technicians had left for the night, Dr. Own stayed in the lab working overtime, pushing the radiation synthesizer to its limits with the hopes of producing a successful demonstration that he could show to the Kingpin the next day. And it was here where he successfully got it to work, creating a huge circle of darkness, similar to a black hole but without the gravity pull. But even with producing this success, radiation began quickly pouring out of the machine, causing this hole to soon after collapse. So before losing it, Dr. Own stepped inside, believing that this was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. And with going inside, he passed out, only to then wake up in a dimension of half darkness and half light. But for Dr. Own, with him entering into this dimension for the first time, he eventually found a large group of spots, which were likely the disruption that was created when he made his way here. So he made his way back to them, with the theory of that being his way home, which was a theory that was correct. But with him passing back through that spot and making his way home, he had then found that the radiation transformed his entire body, covering him with spots, giving him the ability to recreate this phenomenon. But at this point, with Carnage coming after him, Dr. Jonathan Own has no idea what's going on, because as you could imagine, he was just minding his business and then out of nowhere, Carnage shows up and he's coming for his head. But with Own asking Carnage, what is this? What is he doing? What is this about? The Carnage Symbiote really just gives him the short version of the explanation, with him telling Own that he's come here for access to the spotted dimension. And for Dr. Own, initially he tells Carnage like, hey man, I could just help you. But rather quickly he realizes that Carnage is here to kill him and just take it. Not really sure what gave that away. So in a panic, Dr. Own throws spots everywhere, and Carnage reaches into nearly all of them. Which for Own, this is the type of things that nightmares are made of, because at this point any one of these spots could have a scythe coming through it. So from here, Own just tells Carnage that he's gonna have to catch him first. But then immediately, Kenneth Neely, who we've seen tagging along with Carnage this whole time, he grabs Dr. Own by the leg, screaming, I got him, I got him. Which from here, like Neely, he's not enough to stop Dr. Own. But with doing this, it causes enough of a panic for Own to quickly try to make an escape without putting too much thought into it. So when he makes another spot and jumps through, on this end, Carnage goes for a slice and ends up cutting off Neely's hand. And on the other end, Own ends up running right into another scythe from Carnage, which quickly goes in, out, and around him. And after this, the next thing he hears is, "Get over here!" Fatality. With Carnage pulling and slicing Own into countless little spotted pieces. And now with Kenneth Neely just screaming in excruciating pain, which I mean is kinda what you get for trying to be the best friend of Carnage. But it's here where we see Own give his last words, with him saying to Carnage that he can't kill him because Own has the spotted dimension and he will return. But in response, the Carnage symbiote just tells him that he's counting on it, as he picks up one of the spots and he applies it to himself. And from here, Carnage doesn't even bother to help Neely recover his hand, which is something that we know could be done because of what we've seen with Eddie on Venom Island. But instead, he just gives Kenneth a pat on the head, and he tells him that perhaps he has grasped what it would mean to be a suitable host after all, which for Kenneth, this sounds like Carnage is gonna fix his hand. But instead, the Carnage symbiote is like, nah man, that's just a scratch, let's go. And he opens a spot, sending them to their next location. And when we go back to Detective Jonathan Shade, who's currently at the police precinct, getting ready to write up some reports, but as it stands, this sliver that Carnage had given him, it's nearly driving him insane, with it constantly talking to him and telling him that he should attack his co-workers, and it gets to the point to where Detective Shade is like enough, so he then races to the roof to have a conversation with this thing and figure out what it wants, because all Detective Shade knows is that this voice had just come along with the symbiote goo that Carnage gave him, so that he could pull himself back together. And it ends up telling John that it's just bored, it wants something to do, preferably something that involves stabbing and a bit of minimal carnage at the least. But throughout this conversation, Detective Shade and this Carnage slither, they more or less end up coming to a middle ground, with John being stuck with this thing for the time being, but with it telling John that if he wants to catch Carnage and Kenneth Neely, then John's gonna have to break some of the rules to do so. So eventually John asks the sliver, what does he call it, so he doesn't go around looking crazy talking to himself. So it tells him that he can call it Cletus. But from here, John ends up making his way over to a crime scene that's being investigated by Detective Booth, who's taken John's place on the case since the chief thinks that John has just lost it, with him going on about different supers, which is out of their jurisdiction and the quickest way to get this case taken from them, with Booth telling John that he shouldn't be here, he shouldn't be anywhere near here. Cletus shows John a bit of a look at what it would be like if he were to just beat this guy to death, as a way of letting Shade know that if he wanted to blow up a little bit of steam, they could do this right here and now. And with Detective Booth seeing John kind of blank out for a minute, John of course doesn't tell him what it was, but instead he just says that it was a headache and he leaves. But at this point for John, he saw what he needed to see already, because earlier when he ran up to the door, he saw the open brochure with a map that was labeled eastward, which then let him know the direction that Carnage was heading. But with Detective Shade not really knowing what's eastward, aside from a bunch of abandoned factories and mills, Cletus then goes on to tell Detective Shade Carnage is still following his plan, which means that Carnage went out east to go after Dr. Jonathan Own. And Cletus knows at this point there's a high probability that it's too late for them to do anything about that. So in response, Detective Shade is like, so what, should I call it in? But then Cletus tells him that he probably shouldn't, because if Detective Shade calls it in, he's gonna also have to explain how he got that information. So from here, Cletus tells him that they should just skip to the next step, which is the observatory, and meet Carnage there. Which at this point, with Carnage going to the observatory, this is something that Detective Shade just doesn't understand. And lucky for us, neither does Kenneth Neely, who at this point is with Carnage at the observatory. And at this current time, he is begging the Carnage symbiote to make sense out of all of this. Cause like we'd seen, Kenneth had lost his hand, and he believes that the least that Carnage could give him at this point is an explanation, which Carnage does in just a moment. But first he tells Neely to look around the observatory at all the other people who had given up so much more. But then Carnage goes on to explain that this was originally Cletus's idea, because back when him and the Carnage symbiote were together, they'd seen Dr. Halliday on television speaking about Einstein-Rosen bridges and sending particles across dimensions. But this plan had truly began when Knull arrived on Earth with his dragons and gave Carnage a taste of power that him and Cletus had never dreamed of. So then later, when the conclusion of King in Black happened, when Eddie defeated Knull and became the new King in Black, Carnage believed that this should have been him, because after feeling the power of a god and then seeing all that power go to the one person that they hated the most, this caused Cletus Cassidy to come up with a plan for a way to elevate himself and the Carnage symbiote, so that with them not being able to become God, they would instead become the thing that kills gods. And as time passed, Cletus never acted on this plan, and with him gone, eventually the Carnage symbiote believed that Cletus Cassidy was just in his way. So it's here where Carnage then gets Dr. Halliday to power up her machine, as Carnage wraps himself around it and uses the powers that he had taken from Hydro Man and the Spot to take himself and Kenneth Neely to another realm, But as the two of them prepare to make their departure, Detective Jonathan Shade makes his way inside of the observatory in what is yet another chaotic moment, but this time, instead of him getting ripped to pieces and put back together, he grabs onto Kenneth Neely and Detective Shade is dragged along for the ride. But as they're all making their way from one realm to the other, Neely kicks Detective Shade in the chest, which from there sends him spiraling out of control in the space between realms. And so now real quick, I want to give a special shout out to all the patrons. Thank you guys for all of your support. And for anyone who's new here who wants more information on how to support the channel, I got a link below where you can go to patreon.com/DopeSpill. But that'll do it for this one, guys. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below, and we'll do it again on the next one. Alright, later.